Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about data storytelling. That's something that's near and dear to my heart. I actually started my career as a data analyst. I worked at a university looking at environmental issues, and my job was to, really do all the number crunching so that I could help my researchers publish their data and tell a story around it. However, I didn't really know how to tell the story bit. But here is just a lovely example of data storytelling. This is essentially a map of Napoleon's advance into Moscow and the retreat from that, and every little bit of this story, which is a timeline, which we know straight away indicates a story. Every little bit of information on this map is data that illustrates that story. But I don't show you this so that we can look in this in detail. I really just want to make my next point, which is, and this is the bit that I'm concerned about, and that is visualization is not storytelling. When I see people talking about data storytelling, most of them are actually talking about visualization. And yet you don't get the benefits of storytelling unless you actually tell a story. So in this little talk, that little bit of time that we have together, I want to just share with you some very practical ways of sharing a story to illustrate your data and really help the insights that are in your data stick. Now, to start, the first thing is you need to be able to spot stories. You need to be able to say, this is a story, this is not a story. And we have a very simple framework that helps you spot stories. The first bit is that a story nearly always starts with a time marker. So as soon as you hear someone say, oh, just yesterday, or oh, back in 2012, or on Tuesday, they're all time markers, and that's an indicator that a story has started. And if it's not a time marker, it's a place marker. So when you hear someone say, we're all in the boardroom and Bill walked in, that's the beginning of the story. Now, stories are always made up of events. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. And stories have people in them, and people have names. So when we hear names of people doing things, and especially if they're talking to one another, there's dialogue, we definitely know we're listening to a story. And finally, a story is not a story unless something unanticipated happens. So and I should say that it's not a business story unless you have a point to your story. So hopefully you can use this framework now to start to really get good at determining if you're hearing a story or not. That's the baseline. Everyone needs that capability to even do any of this work. Now, a data analyst needs to do three things. They need to build rapport. They need to understand the decision makers they're working with. And then obviously they have to share the story that they've developed, the data story, with those decision makers. Now, we're going to just focus on sharing the story. We don't have time to look at all the elements, but I want to show, I'm going to explain these 5 different approaches to sharing the story. The first one is what I call a data story. I should call it a time series story, really. If you have a graph that is got a time series, you're pretty well presented with the story, right? But sometimes you have to do some work to bring the story out. For example, I was doing some work with a university. An analyst showed me a graph of the percentage of male researchers versus female, and the female percentage was about 30%, and it hadn't changed for 20 years. And so the analyst, she was very confused as to how to tell the story of that. So I said to her, are there things that have happened in those 20 years where you've tried to make a change to that ratio between male to female researchers? And she said to me, yeah, we had done something in 1986, we'd done something in 93, also in 2014, and nothing worked. But I said to her, if you tell the story saying that you tried these things and nothing worked, then we need to do something different, something totally different to what we've done in the past. Now you had a story, and it was really interesting. Her eyes lit up. She finally had a story that she could tell around something that seemed very boring. The second type of story is what I call an explanation story. So an explanation story is when you have data, but you've got to explain the causes that led to the result that you're showing. So this little example is about Jon Snow, but not the one from Game of Thrones, a much more boring one. That was my attempt at a joke. I don't know how it works with the translation. So this is the Jon Snow I want to talk about. Jon Snow was a doctor in the 1800s in London, and he was interested in cholera. Back in the 1800s, London was very polluted. There was a lot of fog. They thought the pollution was the thing that caused disease in the city. But cholera was not caused by the smell. They used to call it the miasma. It was caused by water and what was in the water. And Jon Snow did a map. And this map is of London in a little area called Soho. If you've ever been to London, you might have enjoyed Soho. And the bars that you can see next to the streets, those little black bars, indicate the number of deaths that occurred in a cholera outbreak that occurred in the 1850s. Now, those deaths actually occurred around a water pump that was in the middle of, this is the pump right in the middle where you see most of the black squares. You can actually see that pump today. Here it is there. And Jon Snow worked out that the pump was infected with cholera. He locked the pump and stopped the outbreak. Now, an explanation story is when you tell the back story or the background story that explains what happened that caused this cholera outbreak. And the short version of that is the baby contracted cholera. Her vomit actually ended up into the what they called the septic tank, and that was a crack in it. It got into the water, and then the water got into the pump where people drank from, and it killed 127 people in 3 days. Yes, a sad story, I'm afraid. The discovery story, sometimes your data is just a single point. And so a tactic is to actually tell how you discovered the insight. So here's an example. This is some research that was done by Google, and they discovered the factors influencing team performance, and these are the 5 key factors. So that's the boring non-story approach. The story approach is to say, back in 2012, Google kicked off a research project to work out what factors affected team performance. The researchers reviewed data from 180 teams, and they found that their research didn't match the data, and they were confused by it. But then they came across this idea of psychological safety, and with that, all of a sudden, the patterns they were seeing in the data started to reflect the academic research. So you can see, just by sharing the story of how they discovered the data and the results, it's just a little bit more interesting way. It makes it stick. People sort of remember the work that those researchers went through. And it's actually a more involved story than I've told today, but you sort of get the flavour from this story approach, especially from a discovery story. I think this is just the Google workers, Google researchers doing hard work here. A story example is when you have got good data and it's showing you patterns of behavior or insights, but you want to drill down and pull out just one story to illustrate what's underneath that data. I mean, employee engagement survey data is great. It needs those anecdotes to be told. We did a project for KPMG here in Australia, and one of the stories I found was around this person who had been given a handbag, a beautiful leather Italian handbag, as a thank you for the hard work that she'd done for the year. And when she opened the handbag, inside was a personal note that outlined all the things that she'd done that year that made a difference to the business. The employee said she could have thrown away the handbag right away because it was the note that was most special to her. And she put it up on her cubicle, actually. So that little story gives an insight into this, what it really was like to be appreciated in KPMG. And it was the small thank yous that made a difference. The data really brought, the story really brought the data alive in that case. So my last example is a little bit different. It's when you might do something to trigger a news story to help people understand your data. So my example comes from 1984. Professor Barry Marshall discovered something that was contrary to what all researchers and medical experts believed, and that was that ulcers in people's stomach were actually created by viruses, not by stress. No one believed him, so he actually created a batch of the virus that created ulcers, and he drank it and monitored the ulcers in his stomach, which just exploded in number. And then he drank an antibiotic that cured him, and he showed the world that ulcers were definitely created by this virus that you can get in your stomach. He won the Nobel Prize for his research. So these are the three things that a data analyst needs to be able to do: build rapport, understand the decision makers, and share the story. And we've quickly described these 5 tactics for doing that, of sharing the story. And I'm hoping you get a chance to try them out when you're in your back in your work environments. So that's all I have for you, everyone. I hope that's useful. Please feel free to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and happy to answer any questions that you might have. Well, the Google example has definitely become part of their corporate culture. And the head of HR for Google has written a book about that story and what they learned from the data. So, yeah, definitely it changes cultures once they understand these impacts. So for monthly report, and you want to show, let's say, employee engagement, you might just sort of say, so 4 weeks ago, we put out our survey and the situation was like this. But then these things changed. We made this change and this change. And you can sort of see in the data that's reflected here and here. And as a result of this is how we see it unfolding in the next 3 months. So just by using that time series and those things that have changed, that cause and effect up and down, that will help you tell your monthly report type stories. If you read, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I'm actually just answering a question here on the chat. The question is, what's the most common goal used for data story in your work? And my answer is the most common goal is to influence decision makers inside the organisation. Well, thank you very much for that. That was good, really interesting, and thanks for the translation. You're obviously extremely good at what you do. Bye for now. Do svidaniya.